Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to just this fun time, something different from Samuel Adams Returns as we sponsor this. Reading a book, a really interesting book, that of the Chaplains and the Clergy of the Revolution. I'm just really delighted to be here with you. And today, as I virtually speak with my grandchildren, if you remember from our last session, that I'll have them here and be talking basically to them, reading to them, as well as to you. And we last time talked about the introduction and the first chapter. And in that, some of the things that we're learning is that those clergy from the foundation of our country were absolutely the underlying uh, leaders of the American Revolution. They were not like those during the Cromwell period that were all about right out front, in your face, the whole idea of that being a religious war as much as anything else. Nor were we learned about the Crusades, where that also was that religious war with the priest leading the banner right up front in the whole effort. No, what we see here is that as the Reformation matured and as it was established here in America, especially in New England, the ministers, the pastors, the clergy, those chaplains were the very underlayment of everything that occurred. We just had a great spiritual awakening during this period. People understood what liberty truly meant as it was being taught from the pulpits. We don't get that anymore. And as I mentioned, for my grandchildren, this is one of the many reasons why I'm reading this book for everyone, so that we would have the capacity once again to understand the truths that are there for us from our foundation and how they should be looked at in America in this present time. So, with that, I'm going to take us into chapter 2 of this particular book. Again, my wonderful grandkids just wanted to take, and now let's get into chapter 2 of The Chaplains and Clergy of the Revolution by J.T. Headley, published in 1864. So, as I did in the first chapter, I'm going to go over a little bit with you what the chapter sections are all about, and then get into it totally here. So, chapter 2 is the systematic influence of the clergy, election sermons before the revolution, election sermons a part of the proceedings of the provincial legislature, Samuel Cook's sermon, 1770, Mr. Tucker's in 1771, Charles Turner's in 1773, Gadd, Hitchcock's in 1774, the Tea Overboard, President Langdon's in 1775, Bunker Hill, Monition of the Coming Storm, these sermons, the political pamphlets of the time. There was one way in which the clergy of New England acted directly and systematically on the popular judgment and heart in producing and sustaining the revolution which, it seems a little strange, should have escaped the attention of those historians who have investigated so carefully the means by which it was brought about. I refer to the annual election sermon, as it was called, that was preached before the governor and House of Representatives, especially in Massachusetts, at the election of His Majesty's Council. These sermons were among the most stately and imposing ceremonies as the election itself. The ablest divines in the colony were invited to deliver them, not as a mere compliment to religion, nor were they listened to simply with that quiet decorum and respectful attention which is accorded in ordinary worship, but with the deep interest of those seeking light and instruction. The preachers did not confine themselves to a dissertation on doctrinal truths, nor mere exhortation to godly behavior. They grappled with the great question of the rights of man, and especially the rights of the colonist in their controversy with the mother country. In reading these discourses, one is struck with the thorough knowledge of those divines possessed of the origin, nature, object, character, and end of all true government. They dealt in no high sounding phrases of liberty and equality. They went to the very foundation of society, showed what the natural rights of man were, how those rights became modified when men gathered into communities, how all laws and regulations were designed to be for the good of the governed, that the object of concentrated power was to protect, not invade personal liberty, and when it failed to do this, and oppressed instead of protected, assailed instead of defended rights, resistance became lawful, nay, obligatory. They showed also the nature of compacts and charters and applied the whole subject to the case of the colonies. The profound thought and unanswerable arguments found in these sermons show that the clergy were not a whit behind the ablest statesmen of the day in their knowledge of the great science of human government. In reading them, one gets at the true pulse of the people and can trace the steady progress of the public sentiment. They are like the hands of a clock that, at regular intervals, tell the time of day. The publication of these sermons in a pamphlet form was a part of the regular proceedings of the assembly, and being scattered abroad over the land, clothed with the double sanction of their high authors and the endorsement of the legislature, became the textbook of human rights in every parish. They were regarded as the political pamphlets of the day. Thus, the thorough indoctrination of the people into the duties and powers of government, the reciprocal obligations resting on them and the mother country, were reduced to a system. It must be remembered that newspapers at that day were a novelty, and ideas were not so easily disseminated as now. The pulpit, therefore, was the most direct and effectual way of reaching the masses. The House of Representatives of Massachusetts knew this and passed resolutions requiring the clergy to make the question of the rights of the colonists and the oppressive conduct of the mother country a topic of the pulpit on weekdays. They were proclaimed to all future time their solemn convictions of their dependence on the pulpit for that patriotic feeling and unity of action which they knew to be indispensable to success. Here and then, the historian can lay his hand on the deep, solid substratum that underlaid the revolution. Thus, as far back as 1770, we can see in the election sermons of Massachusetts the dim foreshadowing of the coming contest. In that year, Samuel Cook of the Second Church of Cambridge preached a sermon before Governor Hutchinson, the Council, and House of Representatives. He took for his text 2 Samuel 23, 3rd and 4th verses. Quote, "He that ruleth over men must be just ruling in the fear of God. And he shall be as the light of the morning when the sun riseth, even a morning without clouds, as the tender grass springs out of the earth by clear shining after rain. End quote. He did not apply this text primarily or chiefly to the duty of the rulers to be just, virtuous, and God-fearing, but to them as lawmakers. As I remarked, of the sermons in general, he began by describing the rights which man possessed in a state of nature, showed in what way they became modified when men collected into communities and framed laws for the protection of all. He thus gradually brought before them the design and end of true government, viz., the protection of all the rights of all. Hence followed the necessity of obedience to laws and constitutions. While on this topic, he uttered a truth which men would do well to ponder at this day. Quote, a free state, he says, will no longer continue so that while the Constitution is maintained entire in all its branches and connections. End quote. He then quotes from the New England Charter and asserts that it is not an, quote, act of grace, but a compact, end quote, a mutual agreement, the conditions of which, while the colonies observe, the government at home must respect. He then speaks of the present indications of an attempt to concentrate the power in the hands of the governor and declares, when that is accomplished, quote, the days of liberty are over, end quote. Quote, America, he exclaims, now pleads her right to her possessions, which she cannot resign while she apprehends she has truth and justice on her side. End quote. After thus ably explaining the rights of man by nature, the necessity of laws in communities, the object and end of government, the sacred nature of constitutions and compacts, and the duty of free men to guard with jealous care the liberty guaranteed them, he speaks of the present claims of the colonists, which the government hesitates to acknowledge, and then turns to His Majesty's Governor and Council and the House of Representatives and rings in their attentive listening ears, quote, these their claims the Americans consider not as novel and wantonly made, but founded in nature and in compact, in their rights as men and British subjects, the same which their forefathers, the first occupants, made and asserted at the time of their removal with their effects into the wilderness. End quote. And he winds up with, quote, let every attempt to secure our liberties be conducted with manly fortitude, but with the respectful decency which reason approves, and which alone gives weight to the most salutary measures. End quote. Let His Majesty's Governor and Council hear that and ponder it as well. Let His Majesty across the ocean read it, for his subjects on this side will, and lay it to heart, and every pulpit will echo it. Thus, 5 years before the children of a common stock closed in deadly conflict at Lexington and Concord, did such ominous truths fall on the hearts of the ruler and the ruled. In 1771, the next year, on the 29th of May, John Tucker of the First Church of Newbury preached a sermon taking his text from 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13, 14, 15, and 16. Quote, submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be the king as supreme, etc. This quote, end the quote. This sermon reveals the increased excitement in the colonies and shows what a more determined and sterner attitude the clergy had taken. He goes over the same ground that Mr. Cook did with regard to the origin and design of government and the sacredness of compacts. While acknowledging that government is the work of man, he declares it derives all its power from God, and hence its enactments must be in accordance with his will, and boldly asserts that, quote, the people, as well as their rulers, are the proper judges of the civil constitution they are under and of their own rights and principles, end quote. When he comes to apply the text in requiring submission to rulers, he enters into a full consideration of what kind of submission is due. He says the duties of ruled and ruler are reciprocal and, quote, unlimited submission is not due to government in a free state. There are certain boundaries beyond which submission cannot be justly required and should be yielded. They have, he says, and continuing the quote, an undoubted privilege to complain of unconstitutional measures in government and of unlawful encroachments upon their rights, and may, while they do it with becoming decency, do it with that noble freedom and firmness which a sense of wrong joined with the love of liberty will inspire. End quote. Warming with his subject, he goes farther and declares that they not only have a right to complain, but that resistance may become a duty. He does not, he says, presume to draw the line in the present controversy where resistance should begin, but declares, quote, sirs, it is not necessary if our constitutional rights and privileges should be demanded, we should readily yield to the unrighteous claim. Should we thus meanly resign them up and take in exchange the chains of slavery for ourselves and our children? Could we forgive ourselves? Would our unhappy posterity forgive us? Would we not deserve the punishment while we felt the guilt of assassins for having stabbed the vitals of our country? End quote. Well, may that grave audience listen in breathless silence, and the governor and consul took meaningly on each other. Looked meaningly on each other. For in those swelling tones with which the ministers of God pours forth these bold, exciting truths, they hear the distant bugle call to rally for freedom. Such truths, sown broadcast over the land and falling on the hearts already on fire, exerted an influence that, at the present day, it is impossible to conceive. It must be remembered they were uttered at the seat of power by men of high standing and influence, and sent abroad by that power to the people. In 1773. In 73, the sermon was preached by Charles Turner from Romans 13:4, in which he meets the objection that ministers should not meddle in politics, and while he concedes its force in mere local matters, he boldly asserts that it is their duty to interfere where the liberties of the land are assailed, not only for the sake of their own posterity as well as that of others, but because, quote, when the civil rights of a country receive a shock, it may justly render the ministers of God deeply thoughtful for the safety of sacred privileges. For the religious liberty is so blended with civil that if one falls, it is not to be expected that the other will continue. End quote. 1774. The next spring, May 25th, 1774, the tone of the election sermon preached by Gad Hitchcock of Pembroke furnished the keynote of public feeling and showed clearly the increased state of excitement and the stronger spirit of resistance abroad in the colonies. He took his text from Proverbs 29:2. When the righteous, and I'm quoting here for you, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked bear rule, the people mourn. End quote. The very text was like a trumpet call to battle. To appreciate fully its force and the telling effect of the sermon on those who listened to it and the people who read it, we must recall the existing scenes of the autumn and winter that had passed. First came the news that a cargo of tea had been ordered to Boston. When the bells were set ringing and the people hastened to the Liberty Tree to consult on the matter, exciting harangues were made, and a committee appointed to wait on the consignees and to request them not to receive the tea. The whole town was in commotion, and Governor Hutchinson, in alarm, prepared to flee to the castle for safety. Persuaded to desist from this rash act, he sat, irresolute and trembling, not knowing what to do. At length the tea came. The people resolved it should not be landed, and in December it went overboard, tumbled into the harbor by citizens disguised as Indians. The people then knew, quote, that they had passed the river and cut away the bridge, end quote. The cold and dreary storms that swept over Boston that winter were but a feeble emblem of the tempest of feelings and indignation that raged in the hearts of the inhabitants. Spring came, but the popular tempest showed no abatement. Quote, "Don't put off the boat," said the timid, "till you know where you will land." End quote. Then another quote. "We must," replied the bold, "though we don't know." End quote. Quote, "God will bring us into a safe harbor," end quote, thundered Howley. British fleets and troops were on the way to enforce submission. The land rocked with excitement. The fearful undulation that Boston rolled southward to the Carolinas, amid such fierce commotions within and the gathering of hostile forces without, the House of Representatives met to choose a council for the coming year. Gad Hitchcock was selected to preach the opening sermon. Fresh from the people, whose excitement and indignation he shared, he arose in the presence of the hushed assemblage and launched full on the bosom of the astonished governor. Quote, "When the wicked bear rule, the people mourn." End quote. Having delivered this startling message, he did not follow it up with fierce denunciation like the preachers who addressed the Covenanters fleeing from the sword of the Clavener house. He was not addressing men about to close in battle with their foes, but a dignified body of lawmakers. His whole sermon was a clear and masterly exposition of government properly organized and administered, and of the suffering of the people under oppressive rule. He then stated boldly the grievances of the colonies and the cause of the turbulent feelings and loud complaints that filled the land. Making each point tell on the present condition of the things, he wound up his eloquent discourse in the following bold and startling language. Quote, "Our danger is not visionary, but real. Our contention is not about trifles, but about liberty and property, and not ours only, but those of posterity to the latest generation. If I am mistaken, in imposing plans are formed and executing subversive of our natural and charter rights and privileges, and incompatible with every idea of liberty. all America is mistaken with me? Our continued complaints, our repeated humble but fruitless, unregarded petitions and remonstrances, and, if I may be allowed the sacred allusion, our groanings that cannot be uttered, are at once indications of our suffering and the feeling sense we have of them. End quote. Let the governor in his chair of state hear it. We not only mourn, but with groaning that cannot be uttered, and all because the wicked rule. The castle cannot shelter him from the scorching thunderbolt. Families are divided. Brother is arrayed against brother, friend against friend. Society is cut from its moorings, and hate and consternation reign on every side, and all because the wicked bear rule. King George may say the evils that produce this state of things are imaginary, but I tell you, says Gad Hitchcock, and I tell you the tyrant to his face, it is because the wicked bear rule. End quote. Such sermons had something to do with the revolution as well as the appointing of committees and the drawing up of resolutions. The next year, 1775, that next year, Dr. Langdon, president of Harvard College, was appointed to deliver the election sermon. The contest had then begun. Blood had flowed at Lexington and Concord, and only 3 weeks before, the Battle of Bunker Hill had been fought. Boston was in possession of the British, and the Colonial Congress assembled at Harvard. There was no election of counselors, but it was the anniversary of the day fixed by charter for the election. The Congress was perplexed and ignorant what course to adopt. His Majesty's governor was not there. Neither would they elect a council for His Majesty. And yet Congress had taken no decided steps toward the inauguration of an independent government. Nevertheless, until things assumed more definite shape, they would fulfill, as far as they were concerned, the conditions of the charter. They therefore met on the appointed day and listened to a sermon from the learned Dr. Langdon. He took for his text Isaiah 126, quote, "And I will restore thy judges as at the first, and thy counsel as at the beginning. Afterward thou shalt be called the city of righteousness, the faithful city." End quote. Nothing could be more appropriate than this text. It shows in what perfect harmony the pulse of the clergy and the people beat. The latter did not now need any instruction as to their rights or appeals to assert them. They had already asserted them at the point of the bayonet. The die was cast, and everyone would ask, what would the end be? The capital was in the hands of the brutal soldiery, and the patriots were driven from their homes, which they might never see again. In such a crisis, in such a state of feelings, how beautiful, how appropriate and encouraging is this full, rich promise. He commences by saying, quote, "Shall we rejoice, my fathers and brethren, or shall we weep together on the return of this anniversary, which from the first settlement of the colony has been sacred to liberty, to perpetuate the invaluable privilege of choosing from among ourselves wise men fearing God and hating covetousness, to be honorable counselors, to constitute an essential branch of that happy government which was established in the faith of royal charters?" End quote. He then compares the past joyful day of elections with the present anniversary when the capital is the stronghold of despotism. He goes over the successive acts of tyranny, describes the murder at Lexington and Concord, the slaying of women and infants, and enforces the necessity of repentance and the laying aside of every sin. But after recounting all the disasters that have fallen them and sufferings they have endured, he turns to the cheering promise of the text and says the past, instead of disheartening it, should encourage them. Quote, "Let us praise God," he exclaims in a subdued yet noble enthusiasm. Continuing the quote, "For the advantages already given us over the enemy of liberty, particularly that they have been so dispirited by repeated experience of the efficacy of our arms in the late actions at Chelsea, when several hundred of our soldiery, the greater part open to the fire of so many cannon, swivels, and musketry from a battery advantageously situated, from two armed cutters full of marines, and from ships of the line in the harbor, not one man on our side was killed, and but two or three wounded, when a great number were killed and wounded on the other side, and one of the cutters taken and burnt. If God be for us, who can be against us? The enemy has reproached us for calling on his name and professing our trust in him. They have made a mock of our solemn fast and every appearance of Christianity in the land. On this account, by way of contempt, they call us saints, while their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. And may we not be confident that the Most High, who regards these things, will vindicate his own honor and plead our righteous cause against such enemies to his government as well as to our liberties. Oh, may our camp be free from every accusing thing. May we be truly a holy people, and all our towns and cities of righteousness. Then the Lord will be our refuge and strength, a very present help in time of trouble. And we shall have no reason to be afraid, though thousands of our enemies set themselves around us about, though all nature should be thrown into tumults and convulsions. He can command the stars in their course to fight his battles, and all the elements to wage war with his enemies. He can destroy them with innumerable plagues and send faintness into their heart, so that the men of might shall not find their hands. May the Lord hear us in the day of trouble, and the name of God of Jacob defend us, send us help from his sanctuary, and strengthen us out of Zion. End quote. Such patriotic sentiments and noble encouragement by the venerated head of Harvard College, published and scattered through the army and over the country, performed a mission and secured results which have since been attributed to secondary causes only. Much is said of the intelligence, virtue, and submission to law which characterized our revolution, while those who refer to it with so much pride forget, or at least fail to recognize, the fact that the rebellion in New England rested on the pulpit, received its strongest impulse, indeed its moral character, from it. The people were intelligent and moral, says the historian. But how came they so? Under what system of instruction, or by whose teaching was this state of things brought about? It is not sufficient that he should state the fact, he should give also the causes that produced it. It is not enough to point out to us phenomena, we want it explained. The end of chapter 2. With that, what we see and how the author finishes this is that the historians, as to date, and as I mentioned, especially in the first segment of this, they just don't leave history out. They've been rewriting history. And the fact that we have to ask, what was the system by which we have that undergirding, that foundation upon which we can even understand liberty? And if it's not from the pulpits, if we don't hear it from the pulpits, then we're not getting the truth, because it'll never be in the schools. And what we see now, especially, is that we have everything that is anti God, anti true liberty, anti constitution, anti charter. Uh, Everything is against what are the fundamental established truths, not only for religion, specifically Christianity, but for the country as well. So, with that, I will leave you with the end of chapter 2 and look forward next week as we get into chapter 3. And this is going to take a few days, since this is, as I mentioned, about 46 chapters that was written in this book. And this book, as a reminder, is The Chaplains and Clergy of the Revolution by J.T. Headley, published in 1864. You can download it uh, from the public access in the link below in this video. Thanks a lot. Think about it. Think about what we need to hear from the pulpits once again.